Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to cooperate with MLS. And I'm sorry I'm not able, I understand some Portuguese, I'm not able to speak. Yes. I'm sorry I'm not able to speak Portuguese, and I understand some of it. So if there's something that is not clear, please do not hesitate to interrupt me. Why should secularism and separatism between state and religion be discussed in a seminar that is devoted to individual rights? It could seem a problem of organization of the state. It could seem a constitutional problem. It could seem a problem of how you shape the institutions rather than a problem of rights. In a liberal perspective, separation of church and state has primarily to do with the relationship between individual liberty and religion. Liberty for believers, liberty for non-believers, and equal social dignity for all. Almost always, the outcome of separation is more individual freedom. And that is true even though in history liberty was not always the main reason for separation. In the French tradition, for example, the emphasis is much more on the sovereignty of the nation above any sort of religious, cultural, or political membership of affiliation of the individuals. And the emphasis is on the prominent cultural role of the state, of the democratic state in the Jacobinic perspective. That is much less balanced with checks and balances than in contemporary liberal constitutional democracy. But even in the French tradition, it is very telling that the traces of this idea that can still be found in the French debate, much more than in actual French laws, is still very, very obvious, as it was obvious from the debate that they had in the recent years about, for example, the so-called religious science. Interestingly enough, even in the Islamic countries ruled by authoritarian regimes that pretend to follow the French example, the separation of church and state, as long as it was enforced, even in an authoritarian situation, was much more a guarantee to the rights of religious minorities than anything that can have been followed afterwards. And the case of Iraq, from this point of view, is very telling, I think. Of course, this is not to say that an authoritarian regime is better because, and if it is based on separation, but certainly to an extent, the separation itself is a protection of minorities, even in a non-democratic and non-liberal situation. Take, for example, I said, the debate on the veil, or as it is sometimes said in English, on the scarf. The framework of the debate was, frankly, illiberal. The real aim and the actual results were, in my opinion, liberal results. The defense of the sacrosanct neutrality of the public space as a burden imposed on individuals rather than as a defense of everybody's equal freedom was put before the free development of the personality of minors of age facing long life religious or cultural conditioning. And that was done in order not to risk stigmatizing a social group. Absolutely necessary. Hence, a lot of misunderstandings about that debate, even if the obvious opposite emerged from the hearings that were broadcast by the TV channels of French Parliament. But in general, the separation is the constitutional technique that liberals devised to guarantee freedom in the crucial area of religious beliefs. Separation, if taken seriously, means neutrality. And neutrality means that public institutions should be thoroughly secular. Religious is a free practice in the private domain, but private, in an open society, is the domain of civil society. And it is public from this point of view, and not on legal basis. Public because it is a part of civil society, not because it is a part of the legal system. Neutrality, on the other hand, does not necessarily mean indifference, because it is not indifferent from the point of view of a democratic and liberal state, the free exercise of freedom of religion. These different ideas of separation and laïcité emerged very tellingly in two different occasions in which both in France and in Italy the general elections coincided with the Jewish festivity of the Yom Kippur, for example. At Yom Kippur, Orthodox and observant Jews are not allowed to vote before sunset. The response of secularist French was that the neutral secular French state could not take into consideration these problems, that they were problems of private individuals. In Italy, it was not those usually on the side of a confessional attitude of institutions, but those advocating usually separation, those like us that were the advocates of laïcité in Italy, that asked for that particular general election, the voting time to be postponed in order to allow Orthodox and observant Jews to vote. And that was very telling because sometimes it is said that neutrality is indifference. It is not indifference towards freedom. It is the guarantee, the primarily guarantee for freedom in a multi-religious society. Now, multi-religious open societies need a secular public institutions much more than traditionally religiously uniform European society. And today, as you know, Islam in Europe is asking public recognition, not having usually met separation in the countries of Muslim tradition. All the other established religions that reluctantly accepted in the end to come to terms, at least with separation, and first of all the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy, although still internally divided, are now tempted to seize the opportunity to ask for a new public role, not only of their own religion, but of all religions, and to take advantage of the assumed revanche de Dieu, as it is called, to put non-believers in a position of second-class citizens, to impose to all of us, in the name this time of multi-religious recognition, personal behaviors only consistent with a faith that many of us do not share. Even many more in the traditional interpretation that it is given, as it is the case of millions of Catholics, both in Italy and in all the other countries of Catholic tradition in Europe. Or at least to impose on all of us to pay more taxes in place of those whose faith is not strong enough to contribute financially to the life of the churches as it was in the past, or to require that religious faiths and religious people are given a privileged rank in our secularized society. The more our societies are getting secular, the more public money is given to religious institutions. This is absolutely obvious in the Italian case. What is this public role that is advocated by those reluctant to accept a secular state? What the supporters of this new or open or positive or updated, as it is sometimes called in the French debate, laïcité, or of this new public role of religion is intended for. What they should explain is very simple and usually untold. What public resources what superior social dignity, what greater role, what power of influence should be given to groups qualified or recognized as religious and denied, taken away, or refused to all the others? Answering this question would make things much more clear. And where would we draw the line between what is and what is not religious? Rather, we should stress that religious freedom is not only the freedom to practice the religion of the ancestors, the issue would never have been raised as such, it is also the individual freedom to relinquish one's ancestors' religion. Even more important, the liberal proclamation of religious freedom was the model, the template, upon which all the other liberal liberties were shaped. Now one can date back the fabric of the Western liberal civilization as much as they want, if they want to see some cultural material that were later used to give birth to the present hegemony, as it was said rightly enough this morning in the first panel, for the Western civilization as such. But it was only when the modern idea of the individual and the idea of the irrepressibility of individual conscience that followed after that arose in late medieval Europe, that all these things came to surface and started first in an anthropological way, then with the religious rift caused by the Reformation, to push for more recognized pluralism in the society from the religious point of view first, and then also in the field of the economic life and the political life. It is not true, as it is often said in the American debate, that the Pilgrim Fathers that came to America with the Mayflower were tolerant. They were not tolerant at all. They were discriminated against by the hegemonical church in England at the time. But it is true that there is also a Christian root to separation that was the one that arose during the England Great Rebellion a few decades after the departure of the Mayflower. And it was that great rebellion where demands for political reform, for religious reform, or for economic reform mixed together and gave life to the birth of proto-liberalism in 17th century England. The result that was synthesized by John Locke with the word, "Every man has a property in his own person." Well, it is not very difficult to start from this and reach the idea that the body is mine and I decide what to do with it. That was the framework, the leitmotif of the feminist moves in the 70s. It is not a joke. Every man has a property in his own person means exactly this, that as much as possible, our countries are based upon the autodetermination of the individual and on the recognition that each of us has to do his own choices, even in the religious field, and therefore we should all be equal from the point of view not only of our rights, but also of our recognized equal social dignity. And how can this be possible without neutral institutions, without the institutions that are shared by everybody of us, neutral in face of the religious faith or the religious disbelief that we can have or not have individually? 1,000 years ago, Europe could have been described as synonymous for Christendom. No longer. Our Europe is liberal and religiously plural, and it is the most secularized continent in today's world. Claims for national identities or a European identity based upon religion are not candid, innocent claims that just want to recognize historical facts. What is claimed is an exegetic principle, a criterion to be implemented in the interpretation of the entire system of law, creating thus first and second class citizens. And the biggest challenge of our present time is the paradoxical erosion of the precious civic and historical values that are typical of our historical identity by politicians, by populist politicians that want to cage all of us into closed, homogeneous, and mutually hostile communitarian enclosures. The smaller and the more controlled, the better. And once again, there is the threat from religious intolerance, and it is a matter of controversial ethical issues where no liberal society can allow religious people to have public institutions interfere in the lot of those who do not conform to their wishes and who do not want to be imposed behaviors that are inconsistent with their own principles, opinions, and beliefs in the domain of funding religious beliefs, education, marriage, divorce, family law, abortion, artificial insemination, sexual life, freedom of scientific research, stem cells research, living will, euthanasia. But it is also a matter of equal social dignity and freedom for every single individual, even those who choose, like heretics and reformers in our history centuries ago, to object, to reject, or to relinquish the faith and the traditions of their ancestors. Even more, it is a matter of individual freedom and non-discrimination for those on whom public institutions are led by some religious leaders and populist politicians to impose behaviors or regulations that are inconsistent or disrespectful of their own ascribed identity, as it is the case of homosexuals, or even imposed by public institutions or see imposed by public institutions an official ascribed identity that no one knows whether they accept or not, as it is the case of our younger fellow citizens who are the offspring of immigrated families and about whom we cannot make any assumption on which is or should not be their culture, because their culture is a matter for them to decide, not for the state, not for their family of origin, not for their own communities. So one shouldn't see how our liberal values and principles can be enforced in any institutional framework that is different from our great and successful liberal tradition of religious neutrality and separation as large as practically feasible between religion and public power, with all the consequences that this can have and must have and actually has in our everyday debates on individual rights. Thank you.
Vamos agora dar início à sessão de perguntas. Quem quiser fazer perguntas, por favor. Questions? Anyone? Raise the arm. Don't we have questions to pose? Perguntas? Ok. Luís Lavoura.
Nowadays there are some new problems arising, like for instance Muslims who don't want to be treated in public hospitals because women shouldn't be treated by male doctors and things like that. What would be your response to such problems?
One by one. You can also put questions in Portuguese because I understand a lot, provided that you speak slowly. You were.
My question, you spoke during your intervention on the money now going more to religious institutions now with laicity and the secularism than in the past. And I have been thinking about this topic for some time. because, okay, people here don't know, but my wife, she's Turkish, but so she's from Muslim origin. So I have a lot of discussions with her about secularism, and what I think is in the secularism that we had in the Western world, it worked very well probably with the Catholic religion, because the Catholicism is a centralized religion. So it's something that more or less it's controlled centrally, and we have some control over it politically. But the Muslims is not a centralized religion. It's like you have the imams, and each imam is almost an organization by itself. And this is a problem for the state to manage and to avoid radicalism. That is a new problem. And the solution that we have been finding now, and is the same solution that the Turkish have found, the Turkish state, is exactly to finance and control the religion, because then you create a central organization that can control these radicals. And if we go to the Muslim world, we see this happening not only in Turkey, but in other countries. So I don't know if I have the answer, and of course this is the right answer, but I think that by incorporating new religions that were not the ones we are used to in Europe, we may have to review our view of secularism, exactly because we want to avoid the radicalism that is natural in religions. Okay, I'm an atheist, and I think that religions have a tendency to be radical because this brings them more faithful people. And, well, we have been lucky in Europe because the way that Christianity has been organized. But now it is, Islam and maybe other religions, and even the small Protestant religions that are appearing, that also they are like one or two churches, and sometimes not more than that. So they are also small organizations. And this can bring new problems. So my question is, what do you think about this? And do you agree with me? You don't agree at all?
My question is on the line of the question that Luis asked, but it's broader. I would want you to try to elaborate what is your answer to what is happening today in several countries in the European Union, namely when a religion does not accept the rule of the state, the laws of the state, but that does affect the individual rights of the people they are supposed to take care of. I could give the example, for instance, of the Jehovah's, not to go to the Islam, which don't accept to have blood transfer, and because it's a religious concept, but that affects the individual right of one of the believers to be safe in one case. But this could apply to the right to education of the young Muslims that are not authorized to go to school because of the religion imposition of a concept that is breaking the rule of the law and the law of the state. So what would be your approach? Because I think this is a very complex problem to have a very net answer. But what would be your approach concerning this problem?
So if somebody was shy enough not to speak English, I repeat that I can understand some Portuguese, even if I don't speak it for a second round, possibly. No, the point is this. I don't think we can accept inside of the framework of our societies areas where individual rights are not enforced, not even inside communities and not even inside families. For example, we all accept that children be protected against sexual harassment. I don't think that we can arrive to the point of accepting the idea that an adolescent youth, as described by the New York Convention on the Rights of Children, naturally capable of making his own or her own ideas can be forced in one particular faith because it is the faith of the family or because it is the faith of a community. Now, there are some tragic choices that have to be made. Tragic meaning that there is no good answer and bad answer, because the problem... I'll give you this example about the veil or scarf, if you prefer, in the French debate. At the beginning, I was against any prohibition because I thought, well, let them use the garments that they prefer. There is no reason why we should ask to a 14-year-old girl in a French school not to use the scarf or the veil if she wants. I changed totally my idea and my opinion on the subject after watching a lot of the hearings of the Stasi Commission on French television, because it was quite obvious that in many cases, especially in some areas of the French suburbs, this was not a free choice. And after all, it is very difficult to think of a free choice made at age 12. That is, after, if you use a garment, if you are induced in using a garment, that you always use wherever you are out of your own home, it obviously becomes a lifelong conditioning. It's like for anybody else of us to go outside in the streets without any garment, without simply naked. The French legislator made this choice. At least for 4-6 hours a day, they should be also used not to use any religious sign. They said religious sign, but because they wanted to introduce the same regulation that was introduced, strangely enough, by the Popular Front's government of the 30s in France with an administrative directive in order to avoid political signs as a public order measure, because in the 30s in the French schools the situation was very turbulent and people were wearing six and hammers or other fascist signs, and there were continuously riots. They were told by the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights that given the European Convention on Human Rights, it could not be done with a simple administrative directive. It would require a law, because the convention said that there is a so-called reserve of law. An ordinary law was necessary. So what they could do? Either they could shut their eyes and accept what was absolutely obvious from these hearings. There were hundreds of hearings. The picture of the French society at that point was extremely clear, that there was a generalized imposition of religious signs, namely the veil or scarf. Or they could decide to breach the free will of those girls that really wanted to use it, in order to preserve the right of those who were imposed the use of this garment by their families or communities, with such excesses as the guy sent by the local imam out of the schools to take note of all the girls that were coming out of school without the scarf, or that were not using it inside. And there was this more generalized attitude, for example, husbands not allowing their wives to be examined by physicians that were not not women, or without their own presence, or gymnastic lessons where someone wanted to use a different kind of athletic garment than those of the rest of the class, or swimming lessons that were refused by the families of some girls, or history lessons where you could not teach about the Holocaust, or biology lessons where you were not allowed, or teachers were intimidated if they taught evolutionism and so on. So this situation had to be stopped. The framework that the French gave for this was not acceptable in my opinion, because the framework they used in order not to stigmatize a particular group of citizens was, this is the sacrosanct neutral space of the Republic. And it is not just in the French Jacobinic idea the state itself that has to be neutral, but whatever individual has to attend the events that are taking place in the public sphere. And therefore, even if attending schools is obviously compulsory, those who attended schools could not use, they said, religious signs. The point is that religious signs was a euphemism to say the veil, because the veil had also a different kind of meaning. It was not just a religious sign, as it could be the kippah in the Jewish religion, or a cross in the Christian one. By the way, there was a very ridiculous discussion about the adjective that should be used, ostensible, visible, well, in the end they said ostensible was that is a sign that was a little bit less than visible. It could be visible, but it shouldn't be extremely visible. With, of course, ridiculous. But strange enough, there was not such litigation after this, such legal quarrels as one could expect, because it worked in the end. Everybody were expecting a sort of revolution after the introduction of the law, and the result was not this. But why the veil in particular was a problem? Because it contravened one of the basic principles of our civic coexistence, that is equality between man and women. The veil is not just, today the veil is seen as a symbol for the Islamic faith, but it was something that was used for centuries, had been used for centuries. If you go to the Uffizi in Florence, all the painters of the Renaissance show veiled women that nowadays seem Islamic women, if you accept to watch it, because it was the sign of the property of the males of the family upon the woman. And that's the reason why the veil made a problem rather than the kippah, the cross, or the Fatima hand, that is another sign of the Islamic faith that never was called into question, if not because all religious signs were banned. So from this point of view, I think that the result that they chose, that is at least for 6 hours a day, these girls that are minors of age, and remark, there is no such a prohibition in the French universities, unlike in Turkey. In Turkey, the problem is that the girl students cannot not attend the universities. But given that at the university level they are all major of age, the problem was totally different. I would be against the prohibition of the veil in the universities, because there the students attending are major of age. But inside, if you start at age 12, it is very difficult to say it is an individual voluntary choice. It becomes a voluntary choice in the course of the years, also because saying I no longer want it becomes the recognition of having been subject to an imposition by their own family. And that is psychologically very, very difficult to accept. It's, so this is, in my opinion, the problem. This is paradigmatic of all the other problems that were. It is not a problem that the Muslim religion is not centralized as the Catholic one. Because after all, separation was first used and liberal thinking in religion was first arose in our history by the least centralized kind of Christianity we ever had, that were the congregational churches in England, the ones that were fighting against the Catholic Church, the Church of England, and even the Presbyterians with their federation shape of churches. It was the independent churches, those who said that every single believer has the right to the free examination of the texts, that is working nowadays in some parts of the Muslim world. And by the way, why should we talk about the Islamic world as if it were something homogeneous, as it is not? Inside the Muslim, and even more inside the Muslim communities in Western Europe, the positions are so much different. Think, for example, of the movement of Muslim women that are fighting for separation, for the prohibition of the veil in France, for example. Ni pute ni soumis is neither prostitutes nor subjugated is the title, the name of the movement. We shouldn't consider all those who come from a Muslim country as Muslims, not more than we are allowed to be considered Catholic just because we come from from countries of Catholic tradition. So I think that, and we also have to remember that liberalism in our countries, in this country, like in my country, Italy, like in most countries where it has now more or less robust roots, it has always been an item of importation, of transplant, sometimes of very intentional transplant. It was a product that was born in the Netherlands, then in England, to an extent, then in America, to an extent in France. In all the rest of Western Europe, it is an item of transplant and importation. And that this is especially true for the Mediterranean countries of Catholic heritage. So we think, for example, of the Copts. I think that in most of our countries, if you come from Egypt, you are labeled as a Muslim. However, and in Egypt, there's a 10–15% discriminated Christian minority, that is the Copts. Why should the Copts be considered? Why is the only welfare that is sometimes recognized or available for Muslims that come to our countries that provided by fundamentalist imams, for example? This is another very important problem. It's like those going to the United States 1 century ago from the northern regions of Italy that were sometimes offered the only welfare by the Sicilian mafia organizations in New York, for example. We risk some situation of the same kind because of our blindness from this point of view. As far as the financing religious is concerned, and this is my last word of this subject, I think we should try to use some mechanisms such as the possibility for taxpayers to fund their own religion or the religion of their own choice as an alternative to funding either the state or other charities or secular charities or political organizations and so on. And that would make much more sense than we should think, for example, of the legal form. For example, a foundation that could be the case is probably much more. And then we also should try to make all our citizens aware of these things by teaching them a non-confessional knowledge of the religious thought and religious situation throughout the world, which is, by the way, absolutely necessary in order to be able to orientate in the international debate, because everybody of us, after the Iranian Revolution 30 years ago, understood suddenly that they didn't know anything about Islam and about Christianity a lot of times, also due to the compulsory teaching of the religion, of the Catholic religion in some of our countries.